our guests would stick around and chat with you if you want to stay late. Okay, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Christine is behind the podium. Christine is a new faculty member of the MA TESOL program at Hunter, and she teaches courses on SLA, the teaching of reading and writing, and materials development. She brings to us her classroom experience teaching EAP and her work with university writing centers, including a peer online writing center she developed and directed in Japan. Anne, over here, Edgar, is professor of TESOL and applied linguistics at Hunter. And her areas of interest and expertise include the teaching and learning of second language literacy and English grammar by both novice teachers and English language learners. She's authored or co-authored a variety of articles and books, including Reading for Meaning, some of you may have used it, and Reading Connections. She's given workshops and trained ESL, EFL teachers for more than 30 years in the US, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and Mexico. Kristen De Janeiro is the director of ESL in the English department at Pace University. Her research interests include academic writing, writing assessment, and Generation 1.5 second language learners. Her research has appeared in Language Testing and the Journal of Basic Writing. And our own Shelley Salzman. And she used to teach here. And she used to teach here. That's right. And our own Shelley Salzman. I'm just going to, we all know Shelley, but we're just going to highlight a couple things that she's done for writing, which is why we've invited her on the panel. As you know, she's been at the ALP for 20-some years, has taught levels 1 to 10, including the 4-credit college composition for international students, right, level 10. And she's the chief editor of the ALP Writing Guide, often the third reader of the ALP essay examinations, as we all know, and previously an official scorer, not just reader, right, of the TWE, which is the test of written English, the writing component of the TOEFL. Yes, okay. And the APPEAL, which is the Advanced Placement in International English Language Test. Okay, so there we go. We're going to start with Christine, and thank you so much. All right.
So what you had, I made 20 copies coming around, is a page from Lynn Goldstein's 2005 book on teacher feedback. And it's where I got the kind of title and idea for this presentation. So obviously you can't read this, that's why I have a copy of it. But what I want you to get from it, and just as a kind of disclaimer, for any topic teacher feedback, is how incredibly complex it is. So I'll go to the next slide. This is a little bit simpler, but it basically talks about how there's so many variables and they're all interacting. So I'm going to try to slow that pointer. You have, of course, the teacher and student, but then you have the teacher response student, and that's just the beginning. Then you have things like what to focus on, the comment structure, the institutional and pragmatic factors. Are the students taking the course for credit? What kind of support do writers have at the institution? The teacher's orientation. What does a teacher believe? Then you have student characteristics and teacher characteristics. And she talks about sometimes personal dynamics and backgrounds also affect how we would respond to writing. The other thing that I wanted to show you on this page is just take a moment to read a little bit about these comments from one of her students whose name was actually Bingo. And Bingo, without being solicited, gave her this huge directed help request, basically. And, you know, it says like an introduction, I say the 7th line that he earned his living out of their low profession, do you know what I mean? And asks a lot of questions like this that shows the writer's intention. And this for her was a huge Bingo moment because it made her realize how important it is to elicit from the writer what kind of feedback they like. And basically, what I'm trying to focus on today is what happens when we take these student requests seriously. But before that, I was thinking about my own experience as a writing teacher, and I would have loved Bingo's attachment. So what if you do, what happens if The request looks something more like this. Please check, how's my grammar, or was I convincing? What happens when if it's either you're a writing center tutor, which I have been, or when you're doing peer feedback in the classroom, and these are the kinds of questions you hear your writers asking each other. And you know that they are way too broad and maybe not extremely productive. So what I'm going to do next is tell you what I think are some of the underlying questions about student questions. I think as teachers, we're trying to see how can our writers improve their fluency, their accuracy, and how as writers will they self-regulate. We want them to persevere with the difficult process of writing in a second or third or fourth language. We want them to be able to adapt. What happens when they leave the English Institute and they don't have awesome teachers who are very patient and accepting of their particular, where they're coming from? And how can we develop their skills so that they have a network of critical friends? And I really like this term, critical friends, because I feel like that has two meanings. One is, who is a friend that you're going to turn to when it's 1 a.m. and you can't finish, you're having a writer's block, shall we say, or you didn't prepare as much as you should. And is this the friend that is also a critical reader? Do they give effective feedback? So these are the underlining things that I think teachers are interested in developing and are very much related to teacher feedback. So, I mean, I'm also posing questions for that. Hopefully the panel will help me out with. But again, what support do writers need to ask specific, manageable, productive questions? And how can we manage feedback on feedback, our feedback to students and our feedback to ourselves and colleagues? So this is where I started with some advice from SLA. I bet some of us have this book, Treatment of Error by Dana Ferris. For me, when I first started teaching, I thought SLA has the answer, and this was like my Bible. And I literally, one of my first writing class, photocopied one of the pages in the appendix and had my students monitoring. I would give them feedback with codes, and I would have them mark what kind of errors were most frequent and the possible corrections. And I even would like do a little tally and write some comments. And well, you probably can imagine that there were more issues than these that were targeted, and that this was a little bit not so personal, not the exact warm feedback that they might have been expecting. But they were very diligent, and this teacher must know something, so they did comply. But then I started to think about issues of readiness, and from the learner autonomy literature, I started asking, doing class discussions really. I would give them something to correct, and I would ask them, what would you do with it? Where do your ideas come from? And what are the different ways of giving feedback? What do you think are the intent behind doing something like codes? What is the intent behind doing something like reformation? Or what does it mean when your teacher doesn't give you the answer and just circles? What do you think the teacher or your friend or colleague, what do you think that they're hoping you get from that feedback? And, weigh the advantages and disadvantages. And it seems really basic, but I actually just polled them and said, what method do you prefer and why? Have you ever tried some of the other ones? And I tried breaking down the different kinds of into explanations that they would understand, or that were more accessible than some of the ones from the literature. And I started to do kind of gimmicky things like this. Obviously, I was a little bit desperate. This is circa, I think, 1999 with my clip art. And And basically what I was trying to do here was I thought, I can have them ask better questions if I teach them my questions, and then we compare them. Okay, what did your teacher say, and what did you say? So I'd have my students attach this to their writings, and this was like one that we were using for argumentative writing. And so these here are what the student said, and then I would also give a check or write some comments about what they were missing or in the different color. So it told them what my assessment was, and it told them how they measured up to what I thought about their paper. I think all these methods get you somewhere, but it's not that full picture of Lynn Goldstein's very confused, complex system. So I realized I needed to do something else. Oh, you see, like the students are even drawing this house. They really got into it. There's no trees, and yeah, we really got into it. And at that time, I would have thought that this was publishable, and it was gold. But then I realized I needed to broaden my activities. It wasn't just that event of the paper, as a teacher, I have to do more than that. So I started broadening feedback activities and broadening what I thought they were. And so I would have students, the writing classroom started looking very different, more an integrated approach. I'm sure you're all familiar. So we would do debate, and then we would use newspapers to find the hot topics that they were interested in. We would research to counter-argue, and I started using discussion boards to have them prepare for their debates. And what I liked about this was that at some points, there was always writing that they were interacting with. And so at the end, I would make them, when the debate was over in class, I'd make them switch sides and write an argument from the opposite side. So I was forcing them to go back in and look at what their classmates had said. And from this, I also started noticing what I now call feedback on feedback. I started noticing that my students, without being prompted, just like bingo, were using different colors to talk about the writing that they were co-constructing. And I really liked it. And I thought, oh, this is very clever. And then I also added an element of anonymity. So when they were writing, I would just give them a number, and this PA means peer advisement. And let's see. Then I started asking myself questions about what could the feedback event do? What kind of language is specific to writing good feedback? I skipped a slide, but I will just kind of tell you some of the things that I was thinking about. So I was thinking about the hedging that you might do when you give good advice, when you might play the devil's advocate. Like, well, you did really good in this aspect, but I think you might need to work on this a little bit more. And making connections between that and making a good argument that would say, well, this is a complex issue. Well, I can see your point here. This is a counter-argument. And I started to feel like what also was needed was taking some of this time, because I wanted them to write outside of the classroom. And so as Carol mentioned, I've also done work with online writing centers. But it started in the classroom and can stay in the classroom as long as you keep certain things in mind, like anonymity and fostering with other activities like debate. So I started thinking about, this is the writer, they make a help request. And depending on the level, it might be that it's a very broad question, and I leave it at that. Or I give them scaffolds. Do you have a topic sentence? The standard kinds of questions, depending on your classroom. You can make them more advanced or not. And then I'm just showing that there's this process of first reader, second reader, that I had gotten from the work I'd seen in my classroom. And that they would then email the co-constructed advice to the writer. So you're focusing on answering the writer's question. And then you're also focusing on this kind of cyclical feedback on feedback. next, I'd like to actually show you some of that language. You can start reading here, or it's kind of come around. Okay. So just going back to the original point was I wanted to know how I could develop writers to ask better questions about their writing. And I found that when second language writers were giving peer feedback, and I saw that their peer didn't ask a clearer question, that they started using some interesting language to talk about that. There's some laughter. So that you can see that putting someone in a situation where they are needing to answer a colleague or a peer implicitly was teaching what I could have done if I had told them a million times. So you see that they're getting, okay, your question was too broad and it was quite burdensome for us. And that because this was online, they needed to start using language to be interactive. And still, they don't want to shoot down their friends. So they're basically teaching and saying, okay, this is a very lovely metaphor, like you wouldn't go into a restaurant and just say, can I have some food? You would ask more specific questions. And I started looking at these kind of questions. So what do you want? And so next you see, I use Ken Hyland's model of meta-discourse, and he breaks it down to interactive and interactional, which works perfectly for an online environment. You're talking about interaction. What will be the language that you use to feel close to your reader or show them that you want them to be involved in what you say? So from thinking about students' questions to making them do an implicit activity like this, I started seeing very rich language. And I compared it to classrooms that were students who were not doing this kind of activity. And I found that those who were, this was the subject of my dissertation, were asking better questions, more specific questions. They used a greater variety of that meta-discourse, although they weren't being explicitly taught, hey, this is meta-discourse. They were writing more, they were writing faster because they were spending more time online typing. And they became more self-regulated, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later because I know it's quite literature, right? And for me, it started giving me a window into my own teaching. I could tell from the feedback that learners were giving what messages they had been getting from the institution, from past teachers, and from me. And a nice thing about having things written online is it's automatically saved. I don't know whether it's always nice because sometimes you look back and you're like, wow, like, okay. These slides next will just show any kind of differences. So you can see again these questions. I gave them both groups the same writing, and so I'll just kind of jump around to it a little bit. But you can see again, what do I mean by members? The essay topic was, is it better to be a member of a group or a leader of a group? Typical, like TOEFL. These samples are from Japan, so the writers are EFL writers, and that's their big hurdle. So all the underlying parts are the various kinds of meta discourse that they're using. But if I compare that to someone who didn't have this experience, they do a kind of maybe more distant interaction with their writing. They got the formal style. The formal style, one can enhance his or her organizational skills, but there's not that connection, that interaction with the reader. It's not what we would call reader prose. And I started learning from my students things that they didn't understand. So when a classmate would ask about transitions, they kind of said, "What is that?" And then they looked to teacher resources like this one, or ones online that basically give you a list, right? If you want to add something, you can use these 5. And if you want to do this, you can use these 5. So I had them start making their own materials. Because if they don't understand that, the person they're giving advice to probably won't understand it too. And we see things like this a lot, that's text heavy. They were using, there are more pages to this, but instead of using a made-up text about the person important to me is my mother, they were taking things from literature. So they took Diary of a Wimpy Kid and gave a little excerpt there. They were looking for the published writers, what they were using, rather than what the textbooks were telling them to use, or the teaching books were telling them to use. They were doing lots of little short activities, like things that maybe teachers might think, oh, they're going to think it's more like a testing center. But they would do things like, okay, get a stopwatch, and now ready, like we're going to see how many you remember, or these kind of like, more kind of gimmicky things, but I have to say their materials were fun. Like, you could see that a writer would not feel left alone, and there were little benchmarks everywhere, every maybe 5 minutes that you were working on it to kind of give you feedback. So that was my experience there. So feedback showed me more things that I hadn't thought about from my students. I hadn't thought about them making their own materials, and I hadn't thought about implicit activities that would actually improve higher order meta discourse. And it's gotten me really hooked into giving my students as many chances as possible to use different means to give feedback on feedback. So I'll just segue into some of the things I'm looking at now. So you're probably familiar with track changes. And so I'm just using track changes here, and again, this is a little bit of a different style, but this is the writer's question in black, direction for peer reviewers, and these are the things the writer has asked for in black. And in green is the peer's stab at answering it. And then I'm giving this writer feedback on their feedback with my track changes. But then I'm also adding Skype. And what I'm finding is that when I gave them just asynchronous stuff, like a track change file, that there are, as you could guess, things that I was writing in my comments that they didn't understand. And so now what I do is I wait for them. I'll say, okay, in this example, my feedback was the student just said, remember the quote, practice makes perfect, writing a lot of drafts can help you improve your writing skills. But you also have to proofread. So you can see your mistakes and correct it, because if you don't, you will continue to make the same mistakes over and over. And so I'm prompting the reviewer here, what was the, be specific, what were the mistakes that she made, and can you give 1 or 2 and reformat it for him. And then here I'm waiting as they do that. Also on Skype, I'm not sure whether you have checked out this feature yet, you can share the document. So we're both looking at the document at the same time. This is something that I couldn't have done maybe 5 years ago, but the technology is improving, and I think it's interesting when we try to push it. And here, before I showed you that I had students rewrite materials, here during the Skype chat, we were actually looking online and finding material together and seeing, okay, blending some reading in it, like what do you understand? And so it's just combining the various things and seeing what I get with those new mixes. So just, I'll leave this again as our underlining questions. What does feedback on feedback tell us about fluency, accuracy, how students self-regulate? And with my research, I found that students were spending more and more time when outside of class or outside of any duty that they were doing, like if this were writing center work, they only had to work 2 hours and they were working 10 hours. They found that it was very productive for them, and that when they were making materials, they were spending time doing that outside of what was required. So when I talk about self-regulating, it's things like that, that they're going beyond what they normally would be doing. And yeah, I can talk more about that. I think my time is just about up. Okay.
I have a handout too, but I have a little caveat. My handout is two-sided, and I'm going to ask you all to please look at the side that has the box on it and not look at the back side. And that's because I'm going to give you a task to do with the front side, and later you can look at the back side, where hopefully we'll maybe come to some agreement, or some of the things that I've written on the back will give you some things to think about. So I'm going to pass these around. Pass them here and go that way, and pass them here and go this way. So remember, keep the box side up, okay? Let's see. I'm going to be taking us in a slightly different direction from what Christine talked about. I'm looking a little bit at, she was looking heavily at the students and student involvement and students talking about students writing. And I'm going to be looking at a different slice of the pie. I'm looking at the teacher. And asking this question that says, are we up to the task, okay? I'll be giving a little bit of background on how I'm situating this within the whole, all of those elements that Christine talked about for error correction and feedback. And then I'll tell a little bit about a study that I've been working with. And then we're going to stop and look at the box on the paper that you all have, and then we're going to come back together, okay? Talking a little bit about error correction. So I'm focusing on the whole concept of so-called errors. I just want to give a really major caveat that says, I understand and I agree totally that there are so many ways to give feedback, and errors is just one small slice of the pie. And so there are many points in the composition process. There are many different areas and aspects that we give feedback on, including generating ideas and all kinds of parts of it. But I've chosen here to just focus on one piece that says, if we all agree that giving feedback on, at least at some point in the composition process, giving some feedback on choice of form, then what do we say about it? Okay, so please don't get me wrong that I'm saying this should be our only focus or our main focus or anything like that. I'm just saying, assuming that at some point we do think that focus on form is important, what do we say about that? Okay, we know from SLA research that corrective feedback has an effect on uptake in communicative settings, and that's mostly sort of oral language feedback. And there's, way back, Krashen came out with heavy statements that said we shouldn't be focusing on form except when we have lots of time, when we were prepared to monitor ourselves. And I think a lot of teachers, especially K-12 teachers, and so that's not all you necessarily, but sort of a big slice of our colleagues have sort of went in the direction that says focusing on form is not so good, not such a good idea, and he raised a lot of questions in our minds. However, since then, people sort of took him up and said, well, let's look at this. Let's investigate it further, and a lot of people have, actually, and now we have a fairly substantial body of research that says corrective feedback, at least orally, does actually promote learner uptake. And students actually do get something from that and do improve their accuracy, not just fluency. And, you know, Doty and Williams, Long, Lister and Ranta, and others, there's a whole list of them that goes that direction. If we look at writing, there's been a similar sort of argument about whether it's useful, whether it's helpful. And I know probably my later panelists will keep talking or give us a little bit more on this. You know, some people have said it's ineffective. In fact, it might be harmful. Some say it is effective, and it even promotes learning in other areas. Some have said it's effective in the classroom setting, which is where most all of us operate. And increasingly, though, if we go back to this really wonderful book, Ferris says there's now a body of consistent findings that says students are able to reduce their errors over time with appropriate feedback. Okay? So we've built up evidence, let me say, okay, to support probably what many of us have intuited for a long time. Okay? At the same time, one of the reasons that people have claimed that feedback has not been so effective is because teachers, that's us, have not been up to the job. Okay? And in fact, there's a whole slew of research that says it's really the quality of the feedback that we've given. It's been incomplete, it's been idiosyncratic, it's erratic, and it's inaccurate. Okay? And so that's pretty damning, I think, for us to hear. And in fact, there's a very well-known quote Vivian Zammel made back in '85, which gets quoted and requoted, where she says, ESL writing teachers misread student texts, are inconsistent in their reactions, make arbitrary corrections, write contradictory comments. Okay, now she goes on and makes another point, which is not my point, but overwhelmingly view themselves as language teachers rather than writing teachers. They tend primarily to surface features of writing. Okay, I'm not in any way suggesting we should be attending only to surface features of writing. But at the point at which we choose or students request or we do focus on form features in writing, what can we say? Ferris, the one study that attempted empirically to sort of look at this is Ferris 2000. They found that teachers are correct 89% of the time. Okay, so 10% of the time, approximately, teachers actually made mistakes in the errors, in their identification of errors. Okay? So I said, I think this is very interesting, partly because I work in the preparation of teachers, and I'm very interested in knowing, is it us? And so I wanted to look at this. Okay, so my motivation was to look at teachers' knowledge of the relationships between syntax, morphology, lexicon, and how this plays a role in our understanding our students' errors, in our diagnosing our students' needs, right? That's our job, not just to correct errors on papers, but to have some sense of what they need, right? And that has to be based on our diagnosis of their need. And then my intent is to begin to fill this research gap where there's only one sort of empirical study that looks at all of that. And also to begin to define what do teachers need to know and be able to do? And how well are teachers able to use it, okay? So this Ferris actually comes out and says, while it may be true that some second language writing instructors are inaccurate and inconsistent, There are as yet no studies that support this claim empirically, and one that refutes that charge. So that's where I then took up my questions. Are teachers able to identify and treat their students' lexical and grammatical errors? And I chose to include lexical and grammatical because they really blend with each other. And I'll get into that in much more detail, exactly what I mean by each of those. And I think that's an important crux of the matter. And we'll get back, go further with that. What knowledge do teachers require in order to address their students effectively and appropriately? Okay. So what I did was, as I gave an assignment basically to a group of ESL teachers. These are teachers who come out of a master's in TESOL program. Okay, so this is sort of the widely accepted standard for preparation for ESL. And what do those people? So these are novice teachers. There was some range in their level of experience. The point is not so much, I'm not really comparing groups of teachers or anything like that. I'm just sort of looking to find what are their knowledge needs. What are they able to do well and not well? So, so most of the people who were my informants were novice teachers, so fresh out of a master's program. Okay, I asked them to obtain a writing sample, just like we have writing samples from our students. Identify 3 grammatical and 3 lexical errors in there. It was their choice. I didn't prescribe which ones. I didn't give them the writing sample. I had them use ones that their students did. I asked them to analyze them, develop a treatment. In other words, address each error, develop some kind of activity or instruction, practice, in a sense that you feel will remedy that error for that student, so that hopefully that student will not repeat that error in the future. To then meet the informant again and explain the error, provide the treatment, and then write up and reflect on the process. Okay? So these are self-reports. They are essays that each informant had a different student. Okay? This was done on purpose. My intent was not to see could they all do the same thing. My intent was to say, in a real life, in a real task, so just like all of us have our classes of students, we have to look at them and analyze them and deal with them. Are we able to do those things? And also, I was curious to see what they chose, where they were comfortable focusing on, and that's part of what I hope to find out. So, going through the data, I went through an IRB, an Institutional Review Board process. My co-author, B. McCormick, and I determined categories of analysis for these errors. We were the 2 raters. We normed with each other, and we evaluated student responses separately. Then we brought that back together, and any places where we disagreed, we negotiated. We came up, in a sense, we came up with a mutually agreeable solution. Okay. We developed a list of what we identified were successes and problem areas in what our teachers were able to do, and we made a list of recommendations. Just so you know, we were working with about 80 teachers, and because they were doing 3 lexical and 3 grammatical, that's 6 items each. We eliminated a couple of items that were problematic, either misunderstood or they occasionally 1 or 2 omitted one. So we ended up with a total of 467 actual errors that were corrected in some fashion. And so in our analysis, we looked at, does the teacher correctly identify error as grammatical, lexical, or ambiguous? Because there's overlap between them. Are they able to do this? And just so you know, they were taught this in that MA program, and they were, basically this was part of their training, and so part of the look at this was, could they do it then? We looked at the specific nature of the error because part of what we were interested in is what do they focus on? What are they comfortable focusing on? Is the teacher's analysis accurate? Is the treatment appropriate? And how might we explain if they had an incorrect identification or analysis, what can we say about that? Okay. Here are our results. So out of a total of 467, we their ability to identify errors. Now, these are just raw numbers here. I didn't put percentages in, but you can see. Approximately 79% were able to identify what we two raters independently agreed was correct. Small number here, about 25 people, were partially correct. In other words, they identified there was an error, but they didn't know what kind. There were, however, there were approximately 60 teachers errors in that group that were incorrectly identified. Just either not errors at all, and we were surprised how many of those there were. They identified something that just was not wrong. And this was by, of course, two of our independent judgments. When we asked them to analyze it and then say, what's the error? What's wrong? You notice our numbers go down and the incorrect ones come up. So what was, for us, 79% accuracy went to 66% accuracy. So about a third were incorrect. Okay? Either incorrect, partially, or completely. When we then asked them to address that error and provide some kind of instruction for it, okay? And we judged appropriateness of instruction in terms of, does it fit the error, number one? Does it fit the level of the writing in the essay? Because obviously they need to make it fit the student, right? We didn't know all of the students involved in these essays, but we did have information on their writing. We had all the original writing samples. And we wanted to, basically, we judged that in terms of, did it fit, okay? And what we found was decreasing ability, okay? In other words, even if they could identify that there was an error, they knew less often what it was, and they were able even less often to address it, to develop instruction that fit the error, okay? So what we learned was identifying lexical and grammatical errors was complex. It was complex for us. How much more so would it be for our teachers that we had investigated? And because we both have taught courses in error analysis and in grammatical analysis and so on. Most of our teachers, 79%. Now this was considered a little bit lower than what Ferris found. Ferris found 89%. So we basically found 4 out of 5. It's not 4 out of 5 teachers, it was 4 out of 5 errors was identified correctly. Okay. But that means 1 out of 5, 20% approximately wasn't. 1 out of 5 errors we felt was not identified. This is not even identified correctly as an error. Okay. 2/3, about 66%, were able to explain it correctly. In other words, they were able to say what it was. What's wrong? Not just, is it wrong, but what's wrong? 57% of teachers provided an appropriate treatment. So a little more than half. Okay? So what we found was identification ability was greater or better than analysis ability, which was then even better than treatment ability. Okay? And we found some distinct patterns of difficulty in what they did. And we then worked to restructure those, which was the first one up there was our research question, number 1. The second one down here was our research question, number 2, okay? We found and we came up with some possible explanations for why, in a sense, it might not work, or why our students, our MA teachers were not maybe doing it as appropriately. Okay, so your turn. All right? I'm going to ask you, and part of my reason for this, I think, is to try for us to take a look at some errors ourselves. And I've chosen pretty randomly a single essay by an 18-year-old Spanish speaker. Okay? And so I'll ask you to read through the essay, give you a couple minutes, and then answer the questions at the bottom. So first is, can you identify 3 lexical errors? And we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but I'm curious to see what you interpret that to mean, because I haven't explained it really very well yet. 3 grammar errors, and then, because I'd like to take something fairly easy, I think, let's look at this person's past tense usage. Okay, that's something I'm sure all of you have taught at some point. And most teachers do at some point. So even something quite simple like that, let's look at it and see what we can say. Okay, so let me give you a couple of minutes, and then maybe I'll ask you to maybe just confer with your person next to you and see what you've each found, and if you agree with each other. Okay, since I've been given the 5-minute warning, I'm going to ask if you could share out what you've found, and I'm sure we'll keep looking, and that's fine, and keep marking and keep, addressing. Did anybody find any lexical errors? What would you consider a lexical error? Yeah.
Take care to and take care to.
Okay, take care to.
Modern.
What's modern?
Yeah,
I think it's
More than.
Younger
than.
I think she meant to say younger.
Grammatically.
Okay, is that lexical or is that grammatical?
I think grammatical.
Is there such
It's taking the place of younger than.
Okay.
What about misspellings?
What about
Is that a
misspellings?
lexical error?
I'm sort of leaving out misspellings for right now because yes, it would probably be lexical, but I think it's a sort of a separate category. It's a separate set of issues.
Some of they're phonological and they have a different form.
Yes.
Surface form.
Yes. So modern would be a case of probably phonological. So she probably heard it. This is the closest she could come to it, and came up with modern instead of more than. Okay. So.
What about came
Okay, what about came to? What should it be? Became. Right, so the came, became, that's an easy confusion, right? So that's could be what?
She got
sick. They got sick. Or got sick or became sick. Right, so, but the came, I think, was close to that, okay? Any other lexical errors you noticed? Danger. What should it be? Dangerous. So a word form error, probably. Okay. Needed a derivational ending on there. Okay. Yeah.
The to here and the in home, is that
Okay.
lexical with not recognizing the adverbial meaning of here and home?
Okay.
And so adding a preposition. I don't know whether that's grammatical or not.
That's a good question. That's actually that's one of the cases where it's hard to tell. Is that grammatical or lexical? To hear, we don't say to hear, right? They came here, okay? And here is one of those special words where we don't say to hear. And there, here and there, we use that way, right? In the same way. So is that lexical? Is that grammatical?
Don't they overlap?
Yes, yes, they overlap.
There is grammar and vocabulary.
That's right, there's grammar and vocabulary. In order to fix to hear, can you explain this as a grammatical pattern or as something that's unique to here?
I think it makes it better if you explain it lexically and say that these three words, here, there, home, don't put prepositions in them.
Okay, here, there, home, don't put prepositions in front of them, and then certain other groups, like school, right, where we don't use articles, right? Okay, hospital, jail, class, work, home, go home, and so on, okay?
Which is similar to help to us.
Pardon?
Help to us.
Help to us, okay?
It's
What's that?
lexical and grammatical because help doesn't need the preposition.
That's
So they overlap.
That's right. So that's what linguists call subcategorization rules or syntactic features of a lexical item. Okay? But obviously there's grammatical restrictions. That's right. That's right. And there's some interference going on there, probably. Okay. So in this case, there's a grammatical element of using a particular word. Okay. So it kind of overlaps. But in order to fix it, what do we have to think about? Probably that word, or just a small class of words that operates that way. But not all other words do. We can't teach it with a grammar rule. Okay. So, grammatical errors. What kinds of grammatical errors did you find? Plural. Okay, singular, plural. What? Negative. Okay, no something, right? What? The gerund. Okay, the gerund infinitive choice. Okay, what else? Comma splice, okay, so some sentence structure, run-on, comma splice kind of issue, okay?
Subject or some, there's sentence structure, lack of subject.
Lack of subject, right, omission of subject, okay, it's a typical Spanish speaker's error, okay, what else? Pronouns, okay. Okay, let's go to the past tense. What did you find about the past tense?
There
Yes.
is this interesting one, need went to the hospital.
Okay.
That's so particular, right?
Okay.
Needed to go.
Needed to go.
Past tense marker on the go
Yeah.
instead of
Okay.
Yeah.
Past tense marker went on the wrong verb. Okay, and that's a tough one. That's again, but that's part of past tense, but also part of complementation, right? How do we make complements? Okay, so past tense. What would you say about this writer's past tense? Pardon?
Inconsistent.
Inconsistent. Okay. What would you teach this person in order to remedy her use of past tense? How would you teach her? What would you design, or what would you explain, or what would you design as an activity or exercise for her?
This student isn't using the past tense with stated verbs, it's using simple present. So maybe you would focus the student on, make them aware that stated verbs can occur in all of the places.
Mm-hmm. Is it only stative verbs?
No, probably not. There are a lot of stated verbs.
Okay. Okay.
Know and have two little kids.
Okay, if you flip your paper over, I've listed the verb uses for you. So I've given you the list of the ones that were correctly used and the ones that were incorrectly used. So we can look at those. Are those all stative verbs on the right side? Have, know, take care, sleep, learn, and need went. Okay? Where, as opposed to came, was studying, stayed, helped, went, and told, even though she spelled everything. Okay? Okay.
Except for sleeps, they're more active verbs. She's using them for the students.
So that might be something interesting